start with a little story. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to a picnic in near Palo Alto. And the invitation read, join us for lunch and a conversation about bringing back extinct species to life. And I thought, well, it's your typical Silicon Valley picnic, isn't it? So the presenter for this idea was a fellow named Stuart Brand, who you may know as the author of the Whole Earth Catalog. It was Steve Jobs described as the print version of the internet search engines, like pre-Google, pre-internet. Stuart was a visionary. Back in the mid-60s, he tried to convince, led a public campaign to try and convince NASA to release the first photograph of the whole image of Earth. And with hopes that in seeing that, it was going to change people's perspective of their relationship to the planet, mankind's perspective. And it worked. And now he was wanted to take on de-extinction, bringing back extinct species to life. I learned that there were 10 species being nominated for, considered for de-extinction, the largest being the woolly mammoth. And one is called, the Heath Hen was a game bird that perished from Martha's Vineyard in about 1932. It's about the size between a chicken and a turkey. Ryan Phelan, who is Stuart's partner at Revive and Restore, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to genetic rescue, that there was a possibility that the Heath Hen could actually come back because of the advance in genetics, and also that the greater prairie chicken, its closest living relative, was still alive. The way de-extinction works is that the first thing you'd have to do is go collect museum specimens of Heath hens, and then take the DNA from the footpads and do a genome sequence of them. But the moment something dies, the DNA starts to break down and get corrupted, so it becomes like fragmented pieces. And if you think about what the greater prairie chicken's role in this is, it's like you're having a puzzle. You're trying to put together the pieces of a complicated puzzle. And what I always do is I look at the cover to see, okay, now where's this one possibly go? That's what the greater prairie chicken is going to do, a sequence of the Heath Hen genome by using it as a puzzle, building on the greater prairie chicken and making those edits. We're then going to inject that into a developing embryo, an egg. And that is going to persuade the gonads of that to become a Heath Hen. So those chicks are born, they're going to look like greater prairie chicken chicks, but they're going to have Heath Hen gonads. So they're going to end up laying Heath Hen eggs. I'm not a scientist. It seemed like a crazy idea for me to volunteer for this project. At Friends Academy, I honestly do not remember even taking a science class here, though I'm sure it was required for graduation. So this was, nuts. What I am known for, though, is throwing dinner parties. And I do tend to bring a lot of friends together that do interesting work. And what I like most about that is the interconnection of ideas that happens around our dinner table. It really breeds amazing conversations. And so I thought, wow, if I actually go to the Vineyard and talk to my friends there about this, it will be the first time any community has ever had this conversation, ever, about do we de-extinct something that used to live here and bring it back? And that intrigued me. So I volunteered and brought the community together, and that's really what my talk is about. That you might not know it, but de-extinction is no longer an if something is going to happen. It's here. This is our new world that we're living in. And how we got there, and how does all of the world prepare themselves for this, is really what I'm thinking about and talking about, because it's going to be, I believe, a democratic decision that communities are going to decide how they're going to go about doing this. So I broke it down into 3 steps of how we made this thing happen. The first thing is, you got to know your community. You have to know what their story is, because everybody's got a story. So next day I went to the vineyard, talked to my buddies, and they told me about, when they talked about the Heath Hen, it was with such love and pride and sense of ownership that I was probably as startled to hear this about this bird I'd never heard of before, as they were to hear me talking about de-extinction. But what I learned is that Martha's Vineyard, which is located about 4 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, that it had been the last home for the Heath Hens for 55 years after they perished from the mainland. It used to be quite common all over the eastern seaboard, but they were hunted into extinction. Their extinction was at the hand of man, except for the small flock on Martha's Vineyard. Hundreds of birds at that time. But they were stable, and then their numbers started to diminish. So the vineyard, this is early in the days of conservation where there was no rules to follow. There was no plans out there. This is when John Muir was taking Theodore Roosevelt for a stroll through Yosemite and saying, can we do something about this? Save this land here. So since they had nothing to follow, they just made it up. And they decided that they were going to first stop all hunting. The next thing that would happen was that they created a preserve for the Heath Hens and hired a superintendent to look after them. This was revolutionary thinking back there at that time. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. And Martha's Vineyard became pioneers in conservation. It tells the story of who this community is. The work that they did to save this bird from extinction became really part of the DNA of the community as well. And it's always, I believe, going to be very important when any community is discussing where they're going to go with, or any scientific initiative, or how they're going to undertake it, is you need to know the story of your community. I had no idea who was running the show there. So I had to figure out who it was. And I started calling friends of mine and asking them if they could help me out. And pretty soon I ended up generating a list, which I reviewed with Ryan at Revive and Restore. And we thought, let's go to the vineyard in the off-season and meet with these stakeholders and see if we could get a brainstorming meeting together where we'll talk to them about this whole idea of de-extinction as a newest tool in conservation. So I started making calls before I got there, and most people, and I would say the majority of the calls for immediate reaction was, no, not interested. We're a finite island with finite resources for money, talent, you name it, and you're just going to come and take that from us. So no, we don't want the big glamorous Hollywood idea. You're from California, get out of here. So, but there were a couple of people who had a different reaction. One was a guy who, I remember him saying, it felt like Christmas morning when I got your message, and that I ran downstairs and found this gift under the tree that I had been dreaming of my whole life. Those things keep you going. The people of the vineyard are very protective of their paradise because it's one of those places that attracts a lot of media attention. The presidents go there, but it's an island, and it's a beautiful island, and it's a fragile island. And so they rightfully so were very weary about us coming. And of course the crowds, every summer. Tons of people come to the vineyard. So we respected their position. And I then decided, okay, last thing I'm going to do before I go there, it'd be really great to get some DNA. So why don't I see if it's possible, if we're talking Yankees here, that somebody hasn't cleaned out their grandma's freezer in about 80 years. And so I ran this ad. I got 0 response from it, except the classifieds, except I did get one thing from a very curious and clever reporter who called me up in California and said, what the heck are you doing? So I said, hold the thought, we're coming to Martha's Vineyard. So Stuart, Ryan, and I did go to the vineyard, and our first stop was meeting that reporter at her paper, which is called the Vineyard Gazette. The Gazette's been around since the mid-1800s. And so they were there, and they chronicled that whole story about this whole island coming together to save this bird. And I learned it was actually in international stories that this had been picked up everywhere. And it also said an amazing thing to me about the community and the courage it took for them to do this, the measures they took. And Henry Beetlehoff, their legendary editor, beautifully chronicled the story of not only the extinction of the species, but the last remaining bird, who's called Blooming Ben, nicknamed after his foghorn like call. Me and Stuart and Ryan, and they showed us their archival material on these stories and the obituary that was written for the last Heath Hen. And they pledged their support to this project. They recognized that this was an opportunity to pick up where their story left off, which was in 1932, which that story began in 1906 when they tried to save the birds, to 1932 when the last one died. That maybe this bird was not gone forever. Maybe extinction really wasn't something that was permanent after all. And so they offered to give us coverage, mostly because it also reflected the legacy of the paper and Henry Beetlehoff and the conservationists by nature that they are. It was, it reminded me, actually, of when we went to the moon. If any of you are old enough in the audience there to remember this. But the press and American business really got behind that campaign. People were generally scared about sending a man to the moon. What are we going to bring back? You know, what if something happens? And so there was a huge education process that went on. And by the time that we were actually sending man to the moon, the American people were really behind it because they understood it. So this was critical to our success. And in addition to the Vineyard Gazette, another paper picked up this as well, called the Martha's Vineyard Times, so that both of the island papers provided detailed information about this. And the Vineyard is also a community, has a very, very strong sense of democracy. So these were people that we knew had the power to either make or break this project. So after meeting with them, as I said, we invited all these people to this brainstorming meeting. Some people wouldn't come. He was one of them. Gus Van David has described himself as a self-educated naturalist who, he wouldn't tell you this, but I will, that he single-handedly saved the endangered ospreys of Martha's Vineyard. He was this gentle soul guy, but his voice was so powerful. We really wanted to talk to him, and he really did not want to talk to us. He thought this was a crazy idea. Finally, he let us into his house, and we sat down and explained this all to him. And at the end of this long meeting, sharing stories, you know, really friendly get-together, he said, okay, you seem like nice folks, so I'm not going to speak out against this project. But I do think it's crazy, because even if you find a way to bring back an extinct species, we're in a different world right now. We got hawks like we've never had before. All those fledglings are just going to get picked off. So just because we could do something doesn't necessarily mean we should do something. And we took that to heart. And the last thing he said, I remember this distinctly, is from walking out the door. He said, but then again, I remember thinking, why bother sending a man to the moon? So I also met with a rabbi and a minister because inevitably there have been a number of TED Talks on de-extinction. They all talk about the science of how to do this. And at the end of it, I think at every single one, or almost, they always say, but should we do it? And I think that implication of should we do it is like, are we playing God? So I just thought, okay, let's just go for the bullet, let's go straight for this, talk to the spiritual leaders through the island and say, what do you think? Are we playing God? And the response was actually quite interesting. They said there was nothing in Scripture that said the extinction was a bad thing. But what they did say, in fact, was just the opposite. If God created heaven and earth, then why wouldn't it be our responsibility to protect all living things? That maybe, in fact, de-extinction could change our perspective and it become more of a moral reawakening to save all species, So we held our brainstorming meeting at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and to present the idea, we got a good turnout in the crowd, which was surprising because honestly we didn't know if anyone would show up, but it was about 50-50 people pro and against this idea of de-extinction, which was a healthy balance for what we were looking for. Because we didn't want to sell this idea, even though my training's advertising and sell the benefit. It was really, we wanted this idea to either succeed on its merits or fail on its flaws. We realized we weren't there to shove this down anyone's throat. But I found by, if we're asking a question from selling the benefit point of view, it is, if you ask someone what is to be gained from something, often you'll get a different answer because it ends up suspending the prejudice and it opens up an opportunity for more creative thinking. And that's exactly what happened in this meeting. Even the people that went in completely opposed to this left the meeting thinking it's really worth trying because so many benefits can be gained from just attempting to do this. One thing is we have to dial down the predators. The feral cats, the skunks, the raccoons, which had now taken over the island, was a pest for everyone anyway. We'd also have to bring back the sandplain habitat, which was being encroached upon by the forest that people had planted. But one person said probably the biggest thing of all it would do is that it would get us to have to look at our island and ask ourselves, who do we want to be 50 to 100 years from now? De-extinction requires big picture, long-range thinking. And also it would require cooperation, that all these conservation groups that were competing for money and dollars at the table had taken their Saturday afternoon and spent, I don't know, basically the whole afternoon with us brainstorming. And one of them said, you know, we should do this more often. We never get together. We're always competing. This, they recognized, would one common goal that they'd have to work on together. And in a way, if you think about it, it was requiring of them the exact same characteristics that they had in 1906 when they decided to save a species from extinction. Who they were, showing respect, being open for other people's ideas, courage to try something new. These are the values of this community that they would have to draw upon to even try to think about doing anything like this. So at the end of the meeting, it was decided, okay, consensus, let's take it to the people. So in the middle of Martha's Vineyard, there's a huge barn. It's called Agricultural Hall. I asked the museum and the newspaper, each that had their own historical divisions, to help curate a show, which they did on the history of the Heath Hen. And it was just this stunning show that drew a very big audience from the vineyard because I designed this poster, and Stuart came up with a line, the Heath Hen could come back, which was a perfect balance that we're looking for the possibility of this happening opposed to the probability. It's just how we went into that meeting. But these posters were all over the island. There was a panel that was pulled together, made up mostly of people from that winter conversation, so they were the locals, the conservation leaders, and they shared with the local people, okay, this is what we thought about, this is where we stand on this, and we know it's going to be hard. The possibilities, there are going to be things we know, financially, technology, they're going to be big stumbling blocks that we're going to have to go over, but we think it's worth trying. So we got a good crowd, and they seem to agree, because for two things, don't forget, this was a very educated crowd at this point. They'd been reading series of articles in both the local papers, and they came with really good questions and great observations. They had done their homework. It was put out to them, if you want to do this, it's going to have to be your initiative. Someone's going to have to step up and run at a local level, and the money needs to come from this community. Within a week, the money was raised. You want to have Heath Hens running around the wild, coming back in the eastern seaboard and being a plentiful source of food. It might take 10 years, but it's coming. You're going to fill a niche. So Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small community of people who make an informed decision and decide to have the courage to make a change could have a profound effect on the rest of the world. De-extinction, to me, is more about restoring the human spirit than it is about bringing back any species. Because what it requires us to do is think in a way that's differently about life, all life. So I think de-extinction is actually going to be this generation's moonshot. And perhaps de-extinction will come as hope with a thing of feathers. Thanks.